And I think that's why a lot of anti-realist views that like morality is an illusion or that freedom is an illusion, a lot of these views come out of naturalistic thinkers. You don't find these things in classical theistic thinkers. I think that's the reason why. So I think you're right. There is a tension between believing in reason and its truth tracking ability and believing in naturalism or atheism.
Welcome to the Reality Therapy Podcast, where the truth will set you free.
Welcome to the Reality Therapy Podcast. I'm here today with Omar Haque, and he is a psychiatrist and philosopher and spent a number of years at Harvard. And I'm so excited for a great conversation. So welcome, Omar.
Thank you, Ryan. Thanks for having me.
So let's just get started by telling us who you are, where you come from.
Yeah, so I was born in Tennessee of all places, and have been on the East Coast most of my life, and now I'm a psychiatrist working in philosophy, bioethics at Harvard, and trying my best to fight the good fight and be a good clinician, researcher, and offering patient-centered care and trying to help our profession become less biased in that domain. I work with the Open Therapy Institute as a senior advisor, which is devoted to patient-centered care and providing resources for researchers and clinicians to offer uh, non-politicized insights in the field. And I'm broadly interested in a lot of topics that you talk about.
So there's a couple directions I want to go as we're painting a picture of who you are. And one is you spent a number of years at Harvard, and I just want you to tell me what that was like.
Yeah, I came here in grad school and stayed about 23 years, was a postdoc, teaching assistant, then became a faculty member, lecturer for about 7 or 8 years in the medical school. And I actually recently stopped teaching in 2024 just because it was so ideologically extreme, I guess you could say, and more anti-intellectual. I just didn't feel like I could tell the truth when I was teaching and doing research. So I felt like I would basically have more academic freedom in Massachusetts Avenue or Harvard Square as opposed to Harvard Yard. So I just thought, what am I doing? I'm kind of wasting my time here. I, so I kind of stopped that, and now I just do research part time and focus on other things. But it was, definitely used to be a lot more academically rigorous place, a lot more academically oriented towards free inquiry. But I think it has been corrupted over the last 20 years. I think maybe the first sign of that was the Larry Summers debacle in 2006. But since the last 20 years have gotten more extreme, I think many people have rightly been pointing for reform.
It's interesting you brought up the Larry Summers thing. I don't know if you saw the recent piece by Helen Andrews
Yes.
about the feminization of institutions, talking about I don't know if there's anybody who was criticizing Summers saying that his facts he presented were inaccurate. It's just you shouldn't say that out loud. That kind of
Right.
sensitivity in academia where there's certain things you say or don't say, and whether it's true or not is not part of that equation.
Right. Exactly. And interestingly, even with Summers' controversy in 2006, people were not as interested in whether what he said was true. It was more, how people felt about it and the impact it had. And then I think from his perspective as a president, he did say, I shouldn't have spoken this way as president. I should have spoken this way as an academic. But he did speak as an academic in that private conference. And I remember at the time when I was in school, just being kind of flabbergasted by people's reactions because I was well aware of the evolutionary biology and psychology about sex differences. My mentor Steven Pinker was one of the people who introduced me to that. I was his teaching assistant at the time, and I just thought this is really silly. We're a university. We should be able to talk about any empirical questions, without feeling like we're um, you know living in North Korea or Afghanistan or Saudi Arabia. But of course, there's issues of fairness and equal opportunity, which are also important. But I think if you can't do it at a university, where can you do it? Where can you have these conversations? But these days, at least, I think there's more free inquiry just on podcasts or online than there is in universities. So one of the things I've been trying to work on is nudging universities to be more oriented towards academic freedom, which is a very hard journey to be on, but it's needing external feedback as well, external accountability.
Mm, wow. So you brought up something. You were trained under Steven Pinker, and that's just so I loved Enlightenment Now, and there's a number of just brilliant books of his. And tell me about like how did that cultivate kind of? I'm assuming like an Enlightenment rationalist perspective that you were able to adopt.
Yeah, I'd say I think Steve is an amazing guy and one of my heroes and probably one of my main mentors in life academically, and I really admire everything he's done. And I think maybe he has more of a libertarian approach to things. I personally don't pick a political orientation because I think they're all sort of have some insights to them, and I think I'm more try to be orthogonal to all of those but I think his Enlightenment rationalism is, yeah, inspiring in the sense that it's truth seeking, it's oriented towards neutrality and rationality, but there's also limits to that because I think he overlooks a lot of the non-rational parts of human life, the uh, social and moral values that are relevant to progress as well. If you look at research by Tyler Vanderweel in the Harvard Human Flourishing Program, you'll notice he's offered a different model of flourishing than a rationalistic model, and it includes things like meaning and purpose and more community-oriented values. And you often find that nations that seem to be flourishing on traditional libertarian grounds like GDP, they often are not flourishing on other types of metrics like meaning and purpose or political participation, character and virtue, and things like that. So I think that's one of the things I think Steve's analysis is a little bit minimized on those other domains, but is very good in the areas he focuses, which are rationality and freedom and truth seeking.
That brings up, part of your personal journey, which was from an atheistic perspective for quite a few years to a Christian perspective. How did you make that jump?
Yeah, I actually studied in philosophy of religion was my focus in my PhD. So I started off as an atheist for most of my life. I've been an atheist since probably my teen or early 20s. But around my mid 30s, through studying more the philosophy of naturalism and learning more about the uh, the deep epistemological, metaphysical type of questions, uh, the anomalies started adding up in my mind in the sense that I couldn't account for certain things. But over 5 to 10 years, I thought, well, kind of went from an atheist to an agnostic, saying, well, there are certain quasi theological presuppositions in humanism. That's another thing that me and Steve disagree about. But my view is that if you look at what secular humanism actually espouses, it does. I started thinking, well, these are kind of like quasi theological beliefs that would not be consistent with naturalistic premises. So I think I started thinking there's a tension between naturalism, physicalism, materialism, naturalism, the view that nature is all there is, and humanism. And I came to see that you can't really ground humanism on naturalism. There's an inherent irreconcilable tension between those two, because on naturalistic grounds, not just are we animals, but we're materialistic beings through and through. So you can't really explain a lot of the postulates that are often talked about in humanism, specifically the fact that we're persons, that we are enduring persons, that we have human rights. Where does that come from? And there's dozens of those examples that we're conscious. There's always this there's this trouble. What do we do with that consciousness thing? So all those anomalies started adding up to me. I became an agnostic, I guess. And um, the other thing is, I was actually doing some experiments on this, experimental economic studies, where I realized uh, Christians were actually more pro-social than secular humanists, and I thought that was an anomaly. So I said, well, I'm kind of in this bubble where I think Christians are mean-spirited, parochial, uh, you know, short-sighted, irrational. But when I looked at the actual research on the lives of religious people, including religious Jews and Muslims and Christians, they had better lives. They had more fulfilling lives, more happy lives, more meaningful lives, and they were actually more pro-social, more altruistic. And that was another anomaly where I thought, well, if this is really a good life to be living, well, how come these other people have better lives than atheists and humanists? So it didn't stick well with me. That's not a reason to believe that naturalism is wrong, of course. That's more of a prudential reason or a practical reason. But it did make me wonder, like, okay, if you were an agnostic, why would you be a secular humanist and not an agnostic Orthodox Jew or agnostic Muslim or an agnostic Christian? On practical grounds, you could argue for God as well. But I think primarily for me, it was epistemic grounds or rational grounds. And it's a 10-year, 15-year long journey, hoping to write more about it in the future as well, because people keep asking me about that. But I do think every worldview that's ever existed has had a supernatural or transcendental postulate in it. And pretty much every culture that's currently alive now has some version of that. It's only this one narrow culture of naturalistic humanism, or that's only very recent, that believes in a purely naturalistic worldview, physicalistic worldview. And if you even interview people in Sweden and Norway, they'll say they're atheists, they'll say they're secular, but when you actually scratch a little bit, you'll find they have tons of non-atheistic, non-naturalistic beliefs. Like they'll say, I believe the universe is on my side. And you kind of think, well, how can the universe care about you if if you're just, a fancy meatball flying through space deterministically with, in a meaningless universe? It doesn't really make sense. So most people have supernatural beliefs, and most humanists do as well. They just don't really recognize them as such. But if you really press them, they'll say, oh yeah, I do believe in freedom. But you say, well, how can you do that again? Like, where does that come from? Just trust me, it kind of works out. It's an intuition I have. So I just think over time, anyone who really looks into it deeply will conclude that their beliefs as a human being, are much more consonant with a non-naturalistic worldview. A naturalistic worldview will ultimately dissolve or erode most of the intuitive beliefs that people have, that are both about what's true, but also about what's good, and also about what makes you human. I think this is also seen dramatically in transhumanism or Silicon Valley type atheism. They're a little more explicit in not having a respect for the species boundary or the values that come out of just being human. So that's a long-winded answer to your question.
Man, that's so fascinating. I made the transition from atheist to Christian as well, and I'm reflecting on my experience, and ran into some of these similar things, like the hard problem of consciousness, and like the ability to contemplate the naturalistic worldview rationally, like just that ability is evidence against it. Does that make sense?
Yes, yeah, exactly. So there is a tension in naturalism between the belief in rationalism and the acceptance of a physicalistic or naturalistic worldview. Meaning, if you look at Marxists like Marcuse, or even in Marx himself, so they're atheists, they're naturalists in some sense, but they also discount reason for a particular reason. And I think there is a connection between constructivism, relativism, and naturalism. Marcuse even says that, like, reason is kind of like just an epiphenomenon of power or something. Same thing with Foucault. So that is something that doesn't sit well with an atheist, which is contrary to what most atheists believe. Most atheists, I mean, I was in the humanist community. I was in the Harvard Humanist chaplaincy. I was very much like a part of that community. And most secular humanist communities believe in reason, and they believe in atheism, or believe in naturalism. So, but there's a tension between rationalism and naturalism that is not appreciated nor explored. Specifically, um, you have to start off with this kind of Platonic view of reason. And that's why if you look at Aristotle and Plato, the gods or gods is mentioned dozens or hundreds of times in their tracts, but modern readings of those philosophers ignores their supernatural dimensions. And to believe that just by sitting somewhere in your room and thinking that you could somehow have that thought connect to reality itself using some faculty means you have to really have a trust that your faculties are reliable. But how can you trust that your faculties are reliable? And specifically, how can you trust that reason is reliable? This was one of Darwin's worries. This was one of Nietzsche's worries that they both wrote about. And in the contemporary world, there's various arguments concerning the evolutionary debunking of rationality itself, because evolution selects for survival and reproduction, not necessarily truth tracking. Many things that help you survive and reproduce are true as well. Like, there's a bear coming at you, so you need to be able to perceive an accurate picture of a bear in your mind. But there's many times in which false beliefs can be adaptive. There's many examples in which true beliefs are not adaptive. I mean, just go to the math math club at your school. Those people are tracking truth, but they're not reproducing very much. So their reproductive success is not correlating with their insights. So what that means is that there's a dissociation between truth seeking and survival and reproduction. And so there's this worry that Darwin and Nietzsche both had, that if our minds are entirely the result of natural selection, and by the way, you don't have to give up on evolution if you believe in God. You just have to believe that there was a teleology to the design process, to the adaptive mechanisms, such that the minds that we have started off with a purpose, and there's a process by which that evolved. So, but if you don't have that basic premise, that's where skepticism, in my view, comes from. A lot of skeptical beliefs about whether the external world exists, whether the universe, the past exists, whether time is an illusion. A lot of these things come out of naturalism, and I think that's why a lot of anti-realist views that like morality is an illusion, or that freedom is an illusion. A lot of these views come out of naturalistic thinkers. You don't find these things in classical theistic thinkers. I think that's the reason why. So I think you're right. There is a tension between believing in reason and its truth tracking ability and believing in naturalism or atheism.
That's so fascinating that what you think of is like a very rationalistic perspective eventually leads to almost like an absurdist or surrealist type of perspective where you just throw out any concept of reality.
Exactly. And it's not just about reason. It's also, it also spreads to all the other things that we take as valuable as human beings. Freedom is another one. Our rights, our moral equality, the fact that we are persons. We take for granted that we are persons and we're not objects. Where does that belief come from? It doesn't really withstand a naturalistic analysis. Our entire legal system, our entire constitution, our civilization is based on these non-naturalistic premises. So there's a tension there, I think, that is most people don't like talking about. But you asked me about my own journey, and I spent about 10 years studying this. That's kind of some of the things that made me think. Um, I think the other thing is when you think of a lot of other thinkers who've looked at this, the idea that reason is truth tracking is a huge one. Once you give up on that, you've really given up on a lot. So that's convinced many philosophers to come towards God, I think, over time.
Mm. That's very interesting. I feel like we could spend hours on that topic alone.
Yeah, definitely.
So I want to get into, like, you had this MIT debate about the level of corruption at universities and what's necessary for reform. What can you tell me about that?
Yeah, so there's a lot of reform efforts in universities to improve academic freedom, intellectual diversity, and free inquiry. But oftentimes it's framed as, should we allow the government into this or not? And many of the internal reformers are skeptical of the government being involved. I started off more in the internal reform is great crowd. I'm a member of the Harvard Academic Freedom Council, but I slowly realized that there's a conflict of interest there, because the people who are obviously brave reformers, they don't have as much incentive to reform. And so there's going to be an inherent limit to what one can do. For example, Harvard got rid of mandatory diversity statements, which were kind of like these loyalty oaths that were making people pledge allegiance to kind of DEI woke ideology in order to get a job. And that was a success, but it only happened in one of the like dozens of centers and schools at Harvard. So, great success, but very limited, because most deans and presidents and provosts, they're also captured. So they're not really wanting to kind of take on board these things. And the progress is incredibly minimal and slow. I was wondering, why is that? And I thought, well, yeah, if you look at the history of all reforms, or not all reforms, but most reforms in the university, it pretty much always came from outside. I've done some work in disability rights. And if you look at what changed disability accommodations in universities, it was mostly the Americans with Disabilities Act being enforced. It wasn't a bunch of people coming together and saying, let's write a bunch of papers, have a conference, and just pressure some deans on this question. In the same way with desegregation in the 60s, this required outside intervention from JFK, he had to make University of Mississippi desegregate. Eisenhower at Little Rock, Bob Jones University with President Carter, with racial discrimination, 1983. So I'm pretty much like there's a huge history here, and I think empirically it's just not true that people internally reform. I don't think most people can slap their right hand with their left hand. I mean, it's just not human nature that people who have an incentive to keep the status quo and that they're going to change anything. And people who are academics are conflict averse too, and they're also, how do you rise up in a university? You have to kind of go along, get along, keep your eye out on who's above you and who's below you, and try to, say the right thing to the right people. So it's not really like, it doesn't cultivate people who are courageous or truth seeking. And I speak that for myself as somebody trying to work on my own courage as well. I think I am cultivated in that way as well. So these kinds of people are not really able to reform themselves. So when you look at desegregation, gender discrimination, the disability compliance, these were all imposed externally with penalties. And in the case of American universities, and especially these formerly or so-called elite universities, they've been violating the law, and they have been caught crimson-handed. Harvard was caught crimson-handed in the Supreme Court case, and it's not even like a tiny infraction. It's as I mentioned in that debate, up to 1,300% favoritism for certain groups based on race. So if you look at the difference between Asian Americans and African Americans, given the same academic decile or preparation level, you see up to 1,322% differences in the chance of getting in. The minimum was like a couple 100%, 400%, maximum 1,300 something percent. So this is not just a small thing where you say, okay, well, I'm going to give, two people, one person had a rough childhood. This person was a foster kid. Let's just kind of tip the scale a little bit, 5% this way. It wasn't like that at all. It was more like somebody who, really would, if they were the wrong race, would never even be considered as getting in. And then somebody who is very qualified would get rejected. So when I saw that and how people don't talk about that, if you bring this up in polite company, people will just change the subject. They'll be so ashamed and embarrassed. And it's almost like, how could we have been silent all this time? It's been going on for 50 years. The University of California in 1996 pretty much didn't change much. This has been known for decades. Schools generally don't comply. They try to kind of not follow the law. They technically will try to follow the law, but then do all these other things to get around it. And this professor at Harvard Law School even said right after the Supreme Court ruling something like, we're going to find a way to get around this. So when you see the recalcitrance there, not just with admissions, but also with faculty hiring, we know that this has been exposed. The EEOC is on Harvard's tail on this for hiring and promotions, because I guess Harvard was in such a bubble that it released its own internal rules for discriminating, where they were saying, "Hey, make sure you read the women and the minorities first. Ignore the men and the Jews and the whites or whatever, and ensure that the early lists include women and minorities." So they had all this kind of internal stuff that was released that showed that you have to prefer certain groups when you're hiring and promoting. So I think that's the next civil rights case. Maybe that's the next Supreme Court case that's going to be on the chopping block. But we know that an institution with this kind of culture is very likely to be doing the same thing amongst faculty as what's been doing with students. Why would it be different? I mean, it's the same deans, the same culture, same ideology, and there's very simple tests for whether you can tell for discrimination. It's not hard to find discrimination. All you have to do is look at people who are in the same category, like look at all the students and then just look at their GPAs and SAT scores. And you can see if there's differences by race, then that means they were selected based on different criteria. And the same thing is due with faculty. Take everyone who's an assistant professor, associate professor, full professor, take everyone who's an instructor, just look at their academic accomplishment at that level and quantify it and see. And you don't need to do like a massive high-powered statistical study to figure this out. It's obvious that the same patterns that exist in student admissions also exist with discrimination in faculty hiring. So this is why, these obviously illegal practices are happening all over the country. They're obviously happening at the Ivy League schools like Harvard, but they're happening all over the country, and nobody cares. Nobody wants to do anything. So finally, the Supreme Court set this precedent. And when I saw that, my fellow scholars, academics they don't really care. So I thought, well, gosh, internal reform is not going to work here, and so we need external pressure that is following the law. I'm against any law breaking by the government either. They should follow all the procedures, but the fact that internal reform would be trusted is just laughable. I mean, nobody trusts internal reform when the police are doing something wrong and there's a controversy found for police, but they somehow trust academics to do it. Doesn't make any sense to me. So I think that was kind of my argument at that debate, and I think it also applies to male and female bias against men in hiring. There was a study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences that showed when you do blind experiments and you just give the same resumes and qualifications to professors, there's a 2-to-1 preference for females versus males in STEM. I believe it was biology, engineering, psychology, and economics. The only people who were not biased were male economic professors. They judged the males and the females equally. So we know there's also systematic biases, sexism, you can call it, misandry, if you wanted to call it that. I mean, in hiring for sure. So all of this stuff is now coming to light, and just you see the cultures of the universities getting worse and worse. And so I thought, well, if fire this organization that monitors free speech on campus. Their most recent data was that 79% of Harvard students say it's sometimes okay to shout down a speaker from preventing them to speak on campus. 79%, and I think it was 32% said violence to stop somebody from speaking is at least acceptable on some occasions. So how is this going to work if we keep trusting internal reform? It's just not going to work. So that was my argument. Things are getting worse, and with the killing of Charlie Kirk too, the murder of Charlie Kirk, the younger generations are more radical than older generations. So without some external accountability, I really doubt anything would change. It would just keep getting worse. And that's what's sad, because our universities are treasures, and they should be places of real open inquiry and academic freedom. They should not be places of civil rights discriminations and kind of cancel culture.
So you had this line in the MIT, I think it was in the MIT debate, and it just really resonated with me about these universities are the seminaries of the Democratic Party. What can you tell me about how this political ideology, as it manifests in universities, is like a religion?
Well, if you were in the Kabul Institute for Advanced Sciences or Al Azhar University in Saudi Arabia or the North Korea Institute for whatever it's called, you could very clearly characterize the belief system of the culture, the local culture, which things were taboo, which things were unsayable, which things were sayable. So it could be any pseudo religion, political religion, actual religion. You could characterize it very carefully and very easily, and then you would just be able to predict these are the kind of people who would be admitted and hired. These are the people who would be rejected. These are the things that will get awards. These are the things that wouldn't. This is what the syllabus would look like on this topic. So if you studied the history of capitalism in North Korea, you would obviously see they would eliminate the part where it says, where we know that like the Industrial Revolution resulted from the expansion of markets. And if you went to the, Al Azhar University, they're not going to present the history of Zionism correctly, probably. In the same way, it basically is a secular religion, and that does connect also to this naturalism question. So in this secular religion that's existed from maybe 1975 to now, remember, progressives are only 6% of the American population, but in these Ivy League universities, it's like almost the majority or more. And then the centrist liberals are another big chunk, and then the conservatives are very small. Libertarians are small, but social conservatives are even really small. Because remember, libertarians are not the same as social conservatives. And when people say conservative on campus, they tend to mean libertarians, and libertarians are cousins of liberals. They have the moral intuitions of liberals without as much interest in care and harm. They're just interested in liberty. Social conservatives are very, very different. They're high on all of the moral foundations, or moderate on all the moral foundations, and they're almost non-existent. And those are the faith and flag and family-oriented conservatives. Those people basically are non-existent, maybe 1 to 2, 3% at these kind of universities. So I think it is a religion because it's very predictable what people talk about, what they teach, what they research, what's considered insight. And just to give an example, capitalism is supposed to be bad. Socialism is supposed to be good. Atheism and naturalism is good. Belief in religion is supposed to be irrational, silly, superstition. Um, you know, take any of the postulates of this kind of religion, you'll find all the predictable speakers, all the predictable insights. And very rarely, if you see a panel discussion, they won't really have heterodox or other views. And if you think about the proof of this is that there shouldn't exist these other institutions outside the university. Like heterodox academy shouldn't exist because all the things it does, academic freedom, intellectual diversity, constructive debate, those are the things that should happen in a university. If a university was functioning normally, there wouldn't be heterodox academy. If you look at all these Ivy League schools, each of them has a conservative institute nearby. Like Harvard has the Abigail Adams Institute, which is like it's supposed to balance the syllabi of the Harvard syllabi by giving students outside readings on, Aristotle and Augustine and so on. But if the university was not its own religion, its own like seminary, you wouldn't need this network of outside think tanks trying to balance the curriculum. So um, I do see it as a seminary, and I've been to seminary. I've been to seminary, and I've been to secular university, and I will say it's pretty much just more biased than a seminary. Because when I was in a seminary, I went to Yale Divinity School. We would read all of the secular atheist arguments. We would read all the Jewish, Muslim, Christian arguments, and you would have that. So you have much better understanding when you come from it, when you come as a minority there in that position. Whereas when you're in Harvard or Yale, you're never going to read Thomas Sowell. You're never going to read Eric Voegelin. You won't read all the classical conservative thinkers. You certainly won't read religious thinkers unless it's just to show that they're silly, deluded, or whatever. Probably never read Alvin Plantinga. In fact, in our Academic Freedom Council email list, I sent out this analysis of Harvard's political philosophy course because people were denying that they were saying, oh, that it's just this kind of couple fringe academics in anthropology. Everyone kind of likes to hit on anthropology because it's so obvious, but and the philosophers, they're like, oh, we're so reasonable. We're always careful, and so I opened up the political philosophy syllabus, and I said, hey, let's look at the readings. I went by week, and I said, look, this is all like Rawlsian stuff. It's all Marxist Rawlsian stuff. It's either far left or center left. It's like still 16, 20% of the country is represented here. There was no anarchists. There's no libertarians. There's no social conservatives. There's no religious voices. So, it's basically a giant seminary. It is because according to the 2022 or 2023 survey, 5,000% more liberal faculty than conservative faculty at Harvard. So if you compare that to Hillsdale College is like 46% non-conservative and like 55% conservative. It's much more balanced. So the people that the culture despisers, the liberal secular cultural despisers hate the most are the conservative Christians. And those people have more intellectual diversity, more intellectual freedom in their supposedly parochial, silly Christian school than they do at the Ivy League. And I think that's hilarious, but it's also shocking. So at Harvard, you're getting this very expensive bubble wrapping from reality. You're getting this giant apparatus to prevent you from learning, about other ideas, but they think that they're enlightened. And if you look at the surveys on what most of the faculty don't, or I think it's half the faculty feel like they can't speak openly. Most students don't feel like they can express their opinions in class. I mean, so when I saw all that, I'm like, this is a total joke. I mean, there's no way these people are going to internally reform. We need outside government accountability in a legal way, of course. That was my position.
I think it's so fascinating. I mean, Nietzsche wrote about the death of God and decline of religion in the 1880s, and for a long time we saw a decline of religious participation. And like you were saying, like it left kind of a hole in us because there's this human need for those things that go beyond the rational. And for when religion was kind of taken out of the public sphere and taken out of a lot of belief of a lot of people, it was filled in, like you're saying, by this postmodern and critical theory perspective, which kind of, it's almost like an inversion of traditional religion that kind of fits that need or desire for something beyond the rational.
Yeah, exactly. there's many varieties in my view. There are many types of secular ideologies that can replace religion. It just so happens that we have this uh, due to the phylogeny of progressivism over time, we have this kind of woke ideology that's an inheritor of critical theory and liberalism, but it could have gone the other way. It could have become like something more like blood and soil oriented. It could have been more of like there's a lot of secular blood and soil cultures as well, not just the Weimar Republic, of course, but it could have gone in many different directions, but we got this more communist version of it. And I think, if you look at the history of communism or Marxism and Christianity, what they did was they took some of the intuitions from Christianity, like caring for the oppressed, which, by the way, doesn't really make sense in an atheistic worldview. Why would you care for the oppressed? Like, there's no inherent reason that a bunch of lemmings or a bunch of animals shouldn't, like, what do? The deer, they kill off their weakest deer who are running in the pack. So this inherent care for the most vulnerable is like a grafting off of Christianity and keeping that one moral intuition, and then getting rid of forgiveness, getting rid of the idea of human sacredness, etc., and then kind of running with that moral intuition on its own. So it's this really weird religion that just has this like one intuition. But it could have been an Ayn Randian libertarian atheism. That could
Mm.
have been running the universities as well. But then again, you can say to that person, why do you believe in freedom? You're an atheist. Like, atheism and freedom are really in tension. If you're a naturalist, you can't really believe in libertarian freedom. Where is this coming from? So each of these secular religions hides its true contradictions. And, like with wokeism too, or with Marxism, they believe in that history has a teleology. You're on the wrong side of history. Why would someone be on the wrong side of history? History doesn't have a viewpoint. History is just a bunch of
Mm.
atoms in motion. How can you be on the wrong side of history? No, you're on the wrong side of history. So history has a purpose in Marxism and in wokeism. But if you ask somebody, you don't believe in God, right? So why would history have a purpose? Why would there be a right or wrong side of history? It's kind of like, oh, we don't really take that metaphysically. We take it metaphorically. All right, so then am I metaphorically on the wrong side of history? you know? So the teleology, once you lose that with naturalism, you can't really be woke. And I think that's something people don't understand either.
Yeah, there's no natural reason why an atheist would have any type of morality, but they just kind of declare it to be so, and then to just say, "Trust me, bro," and you're supposed to go along with it.
Yeah, I think that one of the biggest confusions there is that we can have access to moral intuitions. So many of my friends who are atheists are much more better people than I am, and atheists can outshine people morally, but they won't be able to. That's called, well, that's more knowing something. Like, they have moral knowledge, but in terms of justifying why it's a true belief or being able to give a ground for it, that's where the problem exists. So I would say, just to kind of defend the atheist a little bit there, there's a difference between epistemology and ontology. So the ontology is the problem. There's no basis for the
Mm.
belief. In my view, there's very little basis. Maybe there's a good argument that could be made for the basis, but it's weak. And most anti-realists in philosophy are naturalists. You don't find a lot of people. You don't find, like, Don Scotus making an anti-realist account of all morality. It's more Richard Joyce or Mackey or all these other anti-realist naturalists. So there's definitely a connection between debunking morality and skepticism about morality and naturalism, which your village atheist, your sophomore year atheist, is not going to really understand.
Hmm. Wow. So I want to get into, we're talking about the political biases we see in mental health, and I'd like you to tell me about, because you're in the psychiatry world, I'd like you to tell me about what your thoughts are on like current applications of the Goldwater rule.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I I think the use of the Goldwater rule is really important because the goal of any medical profession should be to provide patient-centered care, and for patients to be able to trust that their doctor is going to do the best thing for them, for their health, regardless of their background, regardless of their beliefs. I just think of the case of the Boston Marathon bombers. After that happened, and I remember I was in Boston at the time, they brought them to Beth Israel Hospital in Boston. And those people, those nurses and doctors, they all treated those terrorists just as though they were non-terrorists. And the fact that they did not look at them and say, hey, like let's just like let this person bleed out on the floor in the emergency room. My first reaction was, oh well, those are terrible people. They just killed a bunch of people. What? Then I thought, well, actually, that's part of the duty of a good doctor, a good clinician, is to put the patient first and do no harm and fulfill your sacred obligation to take care of somebody who is, this who is suffering. And that's the high watermark for me. And so when when the profession becomes politicized in a way, there's a huge danger in losing the trust of the population, but also the care we give is also going to be compromised. So with the Goldwater rule, many people know about this, but this was Barry Goldwater, who was claimed to be nuts by a bunch of psychiatrists in the 70s, I believe. And this rule meant you had to really limit how you could apply labels to public figures. When Trump was running for office, of course, a bunch of people actually know uh, had this conference and a book trying to say that Trump had various psychiatric diagnoses and therefore was dangerous and cognitively and morally inept. So they need to raise awareness about this. And I think that has mostly backfired in the last 8 years. It's been seen as a violation of trust and a violation of professional ethics. The American Psychiatric Association came out against it, but the people who are running it, they don't really see it that way, and I think that's unfortunate because I actually had a chance to speak with the leader of that group. Her name is Bandy Lee. She's a great person. She's kind of a friend of mine, and I asked her, and I've known her for 20 years or so. I asked her, Trump turned out to produce a lot of peace in the Middle East, right? And there's no escalation of wars since he started. So maybe he's not, somebody you want in other ways in your life, fine, but that's a personal thing. When Biden was cognitively having difficulties and the special prosecutor, Robert Hur, said he can't even prosecute him because he's so um, cognitively not intact, why did you guys not have a conference then? Why did you not have outrage? Why did you not have a book signed by 30, 50 psychiatrists trying to raise awareness that this person has the nuclear codes and he has the nuclear button and he's in charge of the military, he's in charge of national security? Like, where was the equal outrage? When there's not principled action like that, we lose the trust of the population, we lose trust of patients, and I think that's why, unfortunately, like pastors and rabbis and imams, they don't refer to psychiatrists or doctors as much as they should, probably because there's this perceived, especially with psychiatrists who are perceived to be biased in this way. And we know psychologists are amongst the most left wing oriented in the academy. Maybe people in classics are more right wing a little bit, but probably not that much. And in medical specialties, the orthopedic surgeons are more conservative, and the psychiatrists, I think, are the most left-wing specialty. So there's a huge danger in the mental health field for letting those personal beliefs become delegitimizing. And so I wish there had been a little bit more balance there and also equal application and principled use of the Goldwater questioning. But it is what it is, and we learn from that kind of period.
Is there something naturally about psychology and psychiatry that attracts left-wing minded people, or how did it come to be that way?
I think it's because human affairs are not resolvable at the spectrum of granularity that you can have in a surgeon or surgery. So because of that, people who are more open to experience or more uh, okay with ambiguity are going to be tracking into psychology and psychiatry, whereas people who are more concrete and want more definitive answers will go to surgery. And openness to experience is one of the biggest personality domains that predicts left versus right beliefs. So people who are liberal are more open to experience, uh, good and bad experience, by the way, not just good experience. And then people who are less open to experience are more conservative. The other one is agreeableness. So people who are more agreeable, a little bit more liberal. And so if you're going to be a therapist, you have to be a little bit more agreeable than average. And a surgeon should be less agreeable on average because they're going to have to not deal with other people's emotions when they're bleeding on the floor. Start asking them about their parents' upbringing and how does it feel when I'm putting this catheter in your arm or something. So I think agreeableness and openness to experience as personality domains predict those two specialties, um, biases politically. What else? I guess We know people on the left also have more psychopathology and or diagnoses of mental health conditions. So maybe they're more inspired to go into those fields to begin with because they want to help other people through the compassion that they've found through their own experience, which I think is a good thing. Those are the things that come to mind. How about you? What do you think?
I mean, some of it may be natural, kind of like what you were saying, based on those characteristics. But some of it, I think, is how it's evolved. I'm in the field of counseling, clinical mental health counseling, and I think it's been like colonized by this social justice mindset. So there's things that I would say something like CBT would be like a fairly conservative, or at least classically liberal oriented perspective, because you have to acknowledge that objective reality is real to know if something's a cognitive distortion.
Right.
um, you're asking the client to take some personal responsibility for their life. Those are typically right-wing coded things, and in my program, CBT is very unpopular, I think, for those reasons.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, it's interesting because CBT started as like it evolved out of ancient Stoicism, and
Mm,
Albert Ellis and the founders Beck. I mean, they were reading the Stoics, and it was totally apolitical how it evolved.
mm,
And if you think about it, it doesn't make any sense because left wing people also have the same needs for understanding their schemas in that way. They have equal need for orientation to truth and reality, equal need to understand distortions. They're equally affected by cognitive distortions from like DEI and such. That catastrophizing and black and white thinking, splitting.
mm,
So I would think they need it more because their ideology is actually more dangerous for causing cognitive distortions. If you're a libertarian who doesn't have those beliefs that you get from DEI about splitting and all or nothing, oppressor oppressed, that binary type thinking is not in libertarianism. So maybe they actually need it less.
mm. That's an interesting point. How do you see, just generally in the field of psychiatry? 'Cause I've talked to a lot of counselors, social workers, clinical psychologists. How do you see political bias manifesting in the field of psychiatry in terms of like patient care?
Yeah, I think it's a big problem, and I'm glad your podcast exists to raise awareness about this. But again, my view is that patient-centered care should be primary. We got to get rid of activism in therapy. Your therapist or your psychiatrist should be a clinician first, not an activist. Just like we require Muslims and Christians and Jews and every Buddhist to leave their comprehensive worldviews at the door and bring their clinical self to the encounter. We should also do that with pseudo religions like wokeism. Secular religions have the same obligation so that they can provide care to anyone who walks in their room equally and well. So that's what I see not happening. And I think we should remove ideological statements from bios and in the room because everyone should be welcome. And just like we request that from Christians, Jews, Muslims, we should do the same thing from these sort of secular ideologies. And but I think where does it manifest? Gosh, I mean, it's the reason I work with the Open Therapy Institute, by the way, and anyone should join that organization. It's an amazing organization, the Open Therapy Institute. There's just take the ruling religion and then just n-1, do the inverse of it, and you'll find all the problems. So if you were in the Saudi Arabian Institute for Therapy, you just have to figure out what they believe and then do the opposite of that, and you'll find all the problems. So they're going to have biases against atheists. They're going to have biases against Jews, Christians. They're going to have biases. There's probably some anti-woman stuff from the theology. So you're going to have to look for those things in their therapy training. In the same way here, this woke religion, you know, they're going to have anti-religious bias. They're going to have biases against marriage, against men, against straight people, against people of European descent, against Jews, against conservatives. So that's just very predictable. It's almost like the university. All the biases you see at Harvard and the Ivy League, it's the same thing as you see in mental health training because it's the same ideology that's running both of them. And all those same biases exist in I don't know, which one of those would you like me to explore? I can talk about any of them.
Up to you. I'd love to hear it.
Well, the religious bias is obvious because psychiatrists are the most atheistic, I think, of all the medical fields. They're definitely more
Wow.
atheistic than their patients. So there's a lack of understanding sometimes to the patient's worldview when it comes to coping, but also meaning and things that are really important to understand and how to interpret symptoms and provide treatment. We often don't inquire about patients' faiths because we're afraid of learning that, and so we're missing some of the coping benefits, and or we tend to pathologize those beliefs as opposed to understanding them as part of normal variation or even helpful. Because the irony is that religious people have less psychopathology than secular people, so it doesn't really make sense there that those beliefs should be coded as pathological. That's a false inheritance from Freud and Marx. In terms of um, you know, I think there's mental health costs to the ideology of DEI, just like there's mental health costs to other ideologies. If you're in a cult or something, or if you're in a religion that's pathological, you're going to have mental health costs for those beliefs. So, so like DEI will racialize everything when people don't really have that kind of racial salience, and maybe that's bad for people trying to break down gender binaries and people who really want to be men or really want to be women. They want to get married. They actually think there's something good about being a woman or good about being a man. Um, I think the other bias that comes to mind is um, in secular cultures, there's a bias towards individualism. So in therapy, we're often talking about, you do you, autonomy is the most important value, but patients exist with autonomy and interdependence as balanced values. So most people don't have just one or the other. So many therapists will view somebody talking about their duties as somehow like inauthentic. So they might be more likely to their threshold for telling someone, why don't you divorce that person? Why don't you cut that person off? Oh, your mom or dad said that? Have you thought about just cutting them off and drawing boundaries? The the threshold by which a therapist or doctor will say that varies based on their ideology. So obviously for abortion, euthanasia, have you ever thought of ending your life? No one's going to say that. But, when it comes to end of life care, their thresholds are different too. But there's also a individualistic bias where autonomy is really like the main value, which is, I think, comes from the secular bias in psychiatry. Um, um, I think also like if someone is religious or part of a community, we know that recommending participation improves mental health. There's a 2016 study that showed that religious participation, I think, had anti-suicidal properties 5 times more than lithium. So if we're recommending lithium and we fail to recommend that somebody who already is in a religious community participate in that community, we may be doing harm. But because we're secular as psychiatrists, we probably don't even think about that. What else? I think just treating people with respect. If somebody says that they have a gun and they really enjoy hunting, we should be able to treat that person with as much respect as if somebody says that they, um, you know, opened the border yesterday because they were like protesting ICE agents or something. We should be able to treat all people with respect. But I think, you don't have to look very hard to find the sneers and the jokes and the dismissiveness towards people who are more conservative, like police, gun owners, religious people. I mean, that's just basic stuff. And then those people are going to self-select out of getting help. Um, the anti-male bias is well described on your channel, but I mean, I just could say there's so many ways that is true. For example, we think of sadness and vulnerability as a good, but we don't think of like acting with humor or acting with action in response to distress as like coping the same way. So there may be a bias in how we think of what is good coping or good responding. And the irony here, of course, is men have 200% more suicide than women. Men live 7 years less than women, but there's vastly more like sex specific research for women. How else? Anti-male bias is everywhere in therapy and psychiatry. Like, if you ever had a patient who had domestic violence, they're not going to be treated as seriously if they're a man. Um, the lifetime prevalence, I think, of intimate partner violence, I think it's like 40% for women. It's higher for women and 25% for men. So it's not like men are zero. It's like what 2/3 as much as women. So that's probably an ignored issue. Men mistrust therapy. Men mistrust psychiatry because I think there's a tendency because there's a gender skew towards females, and also because like the APA said that males are inherently toxic, masculinity is inherently toxic. There's like this open misandry in the field, so men run away. They don't want to come and get help, and that's unfortunate. But what I hear from patients is sometimes they say things like, "Well, look, I have to be either emasculated or I'm considered psychopathic. So I can't just there's no concept of healthy masculinity, which there obviously is healthy masculinity, but if according to this woke religion, men are inherently toxic, then it's going to be hard for a normal kid who's 15 years old trying to figure out what he's going to be in the world to find healthy masculinity. He's going to either go to the Andrew Tate side of things, or he's going to try to become emasculated. He's going to try to become like a woman and try to be as feminine as possible to fit into the culture. And both of those are bad options for the average guy. I mean, it would be like kind of like asking women to either you have to tell women you're either going to be stoic or you're going to be pathological. So there's no notion of like healthy femininity either. That would be equally bad for women, but we don't really do that. There's no APA no APA guideline on toxic femininity. There's one on toxic masculinity because of the bias there. So there's so many examples in couples therapy. What else? I think you see it also in anti-white bias, anti-European American bias, which is very taboo for people to talk about. But I'm working with Sally Satel on an essay on bullying amongst kids who report the use of demeaning language, racist language, because in the woke religion, whites are inherently evil and are inherently oppressors. So what happens is that implicitly kids will start to blame themselves just for existing, for being part of a European ancestry. And of course, we know blaming a person for their group membership is the definition of racism or sexism. But this is normalized in our culture. Just kind of like common sense, insults, humiliations. The normalization of violence is not taken as seriously if it's if a European American is killed or bullied versus a minority. We know that with media coverage, of course, right? But as a human rights oriented culture, we should care about every life as equally valuable. We should not disregard anyone based on their sex, sexuality, or race. But somehow, when you even mention that, people just shrug their shoulders and say that's not a big deal. But so basically, you can take the ideology, flip it upside down, and you'll find all the biases. Just like if I was in Saudi Arabia, you would find Jewish individuals being, the suffering of Jewish individuals in Saudi Arabia is probably not a big deal to those people in power. That's the same thing that's happening here with a different secular ideology.
That's so interesting. And I feel like a lot of times they would respond, well, we don't have to be as worried about bullying or violence towards men, white people, whoever the oppressor group is. And sometimes it's almost celebrated because you're like decentering the power structures or something like that, where like there's, they don't often say it out loud, but once you dig into it, it's very explicit that you don't treat everybody equally.
Right. And that's why Marx was very much against human rights. The Marxist tradition is not a human rights tradition. They don't believe in human rights. Marx thought human rights was just bourgeois, like, liberal Christian Protestant inheritances. So I think the best way to respond to that is say, do you believe in human rights or not? If someone says yes, they'll probably challenge their belief there. But the other thing is, what I like to say when people say that is, look, you're against stereotyping, right? Why are you stereotyping people as oppressors or oppressed based on the fact that they're part of a group that has 3.5 billion people or 1 billion people or whatever? Like, there's more variation within the group than between the groups often and most of the time. So if you treat people as individuals and you start with a human rights lens, you'll never go towards wokeism. So I think many people have that evolution over time when they see the cruelty, the callousness, the racism, the stereotyping, the lack of forgiveness. They see it as a very mean religion that they don't want to be a part of.
It's really bizarre because, it's kind of like where it starts is not where it ends. And the beginning of wokeness is be nice to people. And then before long, it's you're supporting Antifa and you've got all men are trash, kill all men, abolish the white race. And it's like, wow, how did we make that jump from be nice to people to, you know what I mean?
Be nice to people, but not everyone. That the
Yeah.
first premise is actually not be nice. It's be nice to only these people and not these people. The intersectional totem pole is be nice to the intersectional totem pole. But if you're in this caste system and you're not at the top caste, you're not at the intersectional caste hierarchy top point, then it's not be nice. It's be cruel, be violent. So it's an inherently non-human rights oriented worldview. It's incompatible with our national founding, which is based on natural law and rights. It's it's yeah, it's more consistent with communism and Marxism.
Hmm. So I've got three questions left for you, and one is, we talked about saying, we need to have this something in our lives that transcends the rational, and that so many people find that through religion. How can we spark kind of a revival of like religious participation in America?
Yeah, I think what's great about at least Christianity is that it also has guardrails to prevent hyper irrationalism. So there's great intellectual traditions within both Catholicism, Protestantism, Orthodoxy that prevent utter irrationalism too. So going beyond the rational doesn't mean becoming totally irrational either. It just means realizing that there are limits to rationality, and part of rationality is learning about its own limits and seeing the fact that there is a spiritual dimension to life, and that not all cultures are equally true, not all traditions are equally moral. That's all part of being rational. But in terms of your question, how to spark that, I think is um, depends on the person. But I don't think our job as therapists is to convert people. But um, that's not your question either, right? Your job is more about the culture.
Yeah,
Or
yeah,
your question is more about the culture.
yeah.
I would say just pointing out empirical truth. If you really believe you believe something that's true, just point it out and say, well, I care about people's health and happiness. Why why do these things lead to lack of health and misery? Sometimes you can get people interested just on those secular pragmatic grounds. Of course, we should not have faith because it's useful. I think that's also not a good
Mm,
idea. But in order to get people interested, you can say, "Did you know that you know religious participation has anti-suicidal properties? Don't you care about preventing suicide?" If someone says, "No, I don't care about that because I believe in full autonomy, people should be able to kill themselves whenever they want," then you say, "Well, now we have a different problem." But most people are going to see that and say, "That's interesting. I wonder why that is." Or, um, did you know that people who are that women in who are married in like a loving religious marriage are happier and healthier than women who are not? I say, "Oh wow, really? I didn't know that." Of course, you have to be religiously participating because nominally religious couples actually have worse outcomes in terms of like domestic violence and such. But the safest, least domestic violence you see is in religious couples who are devoted and religious, like they attend services and stuff. So like when I'm talking to my secular friends who are like, for example, one of my good friends is a social worker who works with women in domestic violence, and I say to her, "Well, did you know that like the least domestic violence actually happens in loving religious couples?" She said, "Oh, it's interesting." So I think those are some ways to get people interested, but also I think most people have a spiritual impulse in them already that's been thwarted. And
mm,
if you ask them to look internally to think about what makes their life meaningful, they might say, "Well, like I love my partner, my wife, my husband, or my whatever they want to call it." You say, "Well, what is love? Do you ever thought about what love is?" Well, do you think it has any? Is it really just chemicals? Yeah, that's what it is. I said, well, okay, well, did you ever feel like it's not more than just chemicals? Yeah, maybe. Well, why should you care about your love? You feel good when you're in love, but why is love a moral thing? Why is it good to love someone? Then, they get into these discussions, they're thinking about it. Well, what if God is love? Doesn't that change how you look at the world? Doesn't that change how you look at each other? Um, if someone says, well, I'm a materialist, I'm an atheist. I don't believe people have souls. They're just like me in this chair I'm sitting on are just only different in degree, not in kind. Like if you just make this chair more complicated, it's going to be me. That's my belief as an atheist, materialist, naturalist. I say, okay, do you really believe that? You really believe if you just made your chair more complicated, it would be you? There's nothing different about you. You don't have a soul. You don't have like a form of being human. Well, maybe I do. Well, why would you believe that? So if you start with all these basic premises, um, why is it wrong to kill an innocent human being? Well, it's just wrong. We live in a Christian culture where that's obvious. But why is it wrong? Well, it's just wrong. Exasperate for the atheist. Exasperation is often their argument. They say, "Oh, what, that's just this wrong. It's true." You say, "Well, why?" Just keep asking the questions. Eventually, you'll hit ground. You'll hit bedrock. You'll hit some moral intuition that requires justification, and most of the time, it'll depend on a theological premise that they've never thought of. And I think the other thing is um, arguments should not be too vituperative. You have to approach them with humility that you could be wrong, and you also have to approach them with a genuine love for the other person and a genuine interest in their well-being. Um, and oftentimes we'll learn that we're wrong. We'll learn what we're wrong about, and that's also important because we want to know the truth. And that's a journey that we should all be on, and we should be happy to be corrected.
I love that answer. So, my second to last question might be more complex, or maybe not. How do we fix the mental health professions?
Yeah, I think join the Open Therapy Institute, and
Yes.
I think we need to, yeah, basically try to eliminate political and religious bias in secular mental health. If someone wants to have a specialty in like Christian counseling, Buddhist counseling, Jewish counseling, that's fine. But we should not make the basic default settings of mental health a religious profession. Like we basically have woke counseling, woke therapy as the default, but it's an unrecognized religion. And we don't allow any religion to be the default. So we should we should secularize in some way the mental health profession and keep a core of patient-centered care that is open to everyone in terms of practices, concepts, and the way we talk and the way we treat people. I think if we can recognize it as a religion, as an ideology, and then decenter it just like we do all the other religions and ideologies, that would really help a lot of patients who are lonely, isolated. They feel alienated because they don't fit into like the dominant orthodox culture, and they'll want to present to get help.
I like that answer a lot. And my final question for you is, when you look at society more broadly, what is one issue that we're not talking about enough that we should be talking about more?
Well, I think you can tell from what I've said in the past here, but I think um, the cost of secularism, naturalism, materialism, atheism, whatever you want to call it, the cost of that is tremendous, and very few people want to talk about that. But I think that is a really really important topic that connects to almost every single social issue. And as our culture has become more atheistic, naturalistic, um, we see a lot of metrics going in the wrong direction. Not just deaths of despair. I think the whole deaths of despair thing can be chalked up to secularism too, because many of the things that cause deaths of despair, not just despair, but the things beneath it, are often related to a lack of connection, purpose, meaning, transcendent truth orientation, seeing yourself as worthy of care, um, seeing yourself as a person with dignity, with rights, and as sacred, and as having a duty to others as sacred entities, and all these traditional norms that have protected people for hundreds of years, taboos, norms that have kept people away from all these horrible things that are happening with overdoses, suicide, homicide, drugs, alcohol, poisoning. It's really tragic. But I think if we had more awareness of the connection between more atheism and secularism and these mental health and health outcomes, people might be more interested in reconnecting to their spiritual roots and communities.
Thought that was a fascinating answer and a very, very interesting conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ryan. Take care. Thank you for having me.